Hi, we're doing our final section on the causation of serial killers today. While some of you very much enjoy the criminology component of this class, other people are frustrated. Take your pick. So we're moving on to discuss the psychological and the biogenic components that may contribute to serial killers, causations. We've already talked about demonology and different types of mythological causations. And then we talked about sociological. Now we take the final step of insanity, psychology problems, psychological problems, and biogenics. All right. So the first thing we need to do is take a minute and talk about insanity. For those of you who are criminal justice students, you may need to know that there's a difference between regular insanity and legal insanity. Regular insanity, using very sophisticated psychological terms, is when somebody's elevator is stuck between floors and maybe they don't have an elevator at all. Um, and that is Jojo, my 32-year-old macaw, and he wants to come out, and he's not. That's why he's yelling hello and funny whistles. Okay, so legal insanity is a person either does not understand what they're doing or they do not understand the ramifications of what they're doing. For example, if pretend this is a candle, of course, it's the best soda on earth, um, and he sticks his hand in a fire, he doesn't understand that every time he sticks his hand in the fire, it's going to get burned. Or he doesn't understand that stabbing somebody is causing physical injury and could possibly kill the person. These are truly legal insane people, and it's very high criteria, and most people don't fit that criteria, which is an interesting problem because we don't want to let people off the hook, but we put some people who are insane, not legally insane, but definitely have psychological concerns. And they end up in a prison which wasn't designed to help the psychologically impaired. All right. But I want to take a second and take an example of who might be considered either criminally insane or have severe mental illness. And to help you follow along with this discussion, you will have under your course materials section a PowerPoint called Psychopathology and Biogenics of Serial Murders. We're going to be following that PowerPoint, so if you want to watch that as we go along with this, feel free. But you also know that you have that resource under that section. All right. So I have a cute little poster here where insanity is why you shouldn't join a cult. And then it shows a picture of Charles Manson. I'm assuming most of you know the story of Charles Manson, where he started a cult and eventually, through the cult, got a little more and more bizarre. He learned to master the, for lack of a better word, let's go with brainwashing techniques, where through the use of drugs, sex, deprivation, things like that, he developed a very close following. He got them to kill one man who stood up to him, and then they went to the Tate family and killed four. And one of those was Sharon Tate, who was married to Roman Polanski, who is a very famous movie producer, director. Um, and she was also very pregnant, 8 months pregnant, I think it was. And then shortly after that, the next day or so, they killed the Bianca family, which was a um, wealthy family from the from the grocery store business. All right. As far as courts are concerned, insanity is a legal term. It is not a psychological term as we described. You can introduce in court psychological information and distinctions, but it's still different and only legal insanity would be an excuse for your penalty. You may say that you, depending on the state, that you are psychologically hindered. Um, I forget the exact term right this second. It'll come to me. All right, but talking about cults, Charles Manson is the most famous for a violent cult. However, he's by far not the only one. The next one I want to mention is David Koresh. David Koresh started out as there was an offshoot of the he was in charge of the Branch Davidian, which was an offshoot of the Mormons. And the Mormons had nothing to do, so please don't be judgmental. But he then, to support the program, he started dealing with guns and gun repair. And he then he caught the attention of ATF, where ATF wanted to know what the hell is this guy doing with all these guns. And he even had silencers and everything else. Silencers is a trigger. Why are you going to be shooting people that you can't have it be heard? You're obviously not shooting at targets because you don't care at a target that makes noise. But he ended up, in most people's opinion, he is a mass murderer. And a mass murderer is different than a serial killer. Remember in the first class we discussed this. A serial killer kills more than two people over a long period of time with gaps in between, where a mass murderer may have very short gaps, a matter of hours or something, and kill several people. Many, if not all mass murderers have a history of mental illness, not the same as legal insanity. And most mass murderers were found to have several major life events that threw them into a flurry, which may have started or precipitated the murders. In other words, David Koresh started out as a leader with somebody else, and that person rejected him. He was a very smart man, and he memorized the Bible from cover to cover. He then started teaching and making his followers stay up all night long listening to his preach. And they were severely penalized if they fell asleep. They were beaten, they were sometimes tortured. He also raped all the little girls in the cult. And eventually the ATF said enough. And they went in and tried to get into the thing, and it ended up becoming a standoff. And it got national attention because Janet Reno had just become the first woman attorney general. And secondly, the Ruby Ridge incident, which was a catastrophe with the feds, had just occurred a few months before that, I think. Okay, and what he did was he ended up doing a stalemate that went on for, I don't know, 50 days, I think. And at the end, when they finally said enough, he killed 4 federal agencies in a flurry of gunfire. And we, the government, shot gas into the place, and there were still some children. Most of the children had been confiscated, but there was children in there and families and everything else. And the raid then continued, and the place burnt down. David Koresh refused to allow the people to leave, and so many died because he would not allow them to leave. And that was a very simplified version of what happened at Waco, Texas. And Waco, Texas, I think was done somewhere around the anniversary of Ruby Ridge, but there's a connection, and a lot of militia and radicals strongly believe in that connection. In fact, that connection between Ruby Ridge and Waco led to the bombing of the Murrow building in Oklahoma, and more people died and babies died and everything. We'll be discussing that this semester. Okay, so It is important, though, to understand that cults, usually the leaders are unstable, often very mentally ill, and the followers get lured in bits and pieces and starts buying them. And they all use different methodology to get the people to join into the familyhood and would obey and comply them. And a lot of the techniques would involve drugs. Lack of sleep is a big one in all of them, and constant reinforcement of doctrine. Like his in David Koresh's point of view, long, tedious methodology. The interesting thing is at one point it shifted where he believing he was Jesus Christ. And so, how do you not obey Jesus Christ? And that was the dilemma for some people. Okay, talking about legal insanity, I just briefly want to point out to you there is a slide in there that discusses the McNaughton rule, the irresistible impulse test, the Brunner rule, substantial capacity test, and the Durham rule, known also as the products test. These are different ways that different states have established to determine who is legally insane. Underneath that slide is some notes that differentiate them and explain them. I'm not going to take the time to do this now. However, you're expected to know this. So if you're not familiar with the different tests, please take a look. I also put on the same slide some people, two people, that are prime examples of insane. I mean, truly deep down, legally, psychologically, any standard you want to apply, they're insane. And they both became serial killers. One is Joseph Callinger, he's known as the shoemaker, and the other is Edward Theodore Edgeen. He was the star of 3 movies, not him personally, but his motif influenced 3 scary movies. So we're going to talk about both of these two guys. The first one we're going to talk about is Joseph Callinger. He died in 1996, which just flips me out because most of you weren't even born yet. Okay. He was a serial killer from Philadelphia. He was a very, very religious man. He was adopted by the Callingers strictly for the purpose to carry on the family tradition and the family store, which specialized as cobblers, as shoe repairmen. But he murdered 3 people and tortured 4 families. He committed these crimes with the help of his 13-year-old son, Michael. There's a lot to be said by him. He was originally brought to the attention of the police and everything on a child abuse case. And he was considered unstable then, but he managed to evade that. And at that time, psychologists and psychiatrists recommended that when he's around his family, he should be supervised. But he wasn't. He's a wonderful person if you're interested in how the insane can function so that an outsider at a glance will think he's totally sane. But he did a couple of very strange things. He had his 13-year-old son help him murder his oldest son because his oldest son, in his mind, was disrespectful to him and to the family and to the tradition because, as many teenage sons are, he questioned things. And in his case, questioning was legit. But the sad part was it took several attempts to kill the son. Yeah. And it is frightening how they did it. And his daughter ran away, and the police brought her back. And to prevent her from doing it again, he branded her. Y'all know what brand it is, where you take the metal like you would with a cow or something. You would take the metal and make it very, very hot and then put it against flesh where it burns into the skin and it'll never go away. And he did that to the daughter. Um, the children filed a complaint that he was abusive and mentally ill, um, with the motivation started by the daughter and the father, even before the brother, oldest brother, and the daughter, even before the branding and everything happened. And they were suddenly persuaded to withdraw the complaint. And that involved the conditions that they were living in and the religious effect and everything else. So he then takes out the insurance policy on the oldest son and then set to killing him. And through the years, they would go through using foul play and blowing things up. And Michael became his magnificent killer when they killed all those people. Joseph Callinger um, died in 1996, but he was still to this day prevalent. And the store's gone, but it's still everybody knows that that's the building that this all happened. And his step parent, his um, adoptive parents were very clear that he was only adopted for the purpose of continuing the family tradition of running that store. And he never felt loved and he never felt any sense of security, but he made sure that his family didn't either. In fact, they were scared of him, and rightfully so. All right, so we need to talk about mental illness. We're going to talk about neurosis, psychosis, and dissociative disorders, of which there are four that we're going to have to discuss. All right, and neurosis is a class of, um, pulling up my notes, hold on, mental disorders involving distress, but there's no delusions, there's no hallucinations. Um, but the guy, I say generically, women suffer from this just as well. Um, though they are unstable and disturbed, they're not without the social limits. They live within the same social stability that all of us live in, within acceptable norms. A dissociative disorder is different, where it's more involved, and it includes breakdowns of memory, consciousness, and awareness. It can involve fugues, which is you may lose large gaps of time. It also is where a person, when they're doing okay, will function normally, but these functions can be very suddenly disrupted, and then symptoms result, and then they totally collapse for a while, and then they can eventually be set in. I just realized I skipped psychosis. Psychosis is a psychiatric condition that causes a person to lose his or her sense of reality. These are the people that have the hallucinations. They have delusions. They are very disorganized in their thinking. It's hard for them to focus, and they may even hear voices. So sometimes they don't know whose voices are real and whose voices are not. Psychosis can be very disturbing, and um, they may not even realize that something is wrong. Okay. Now, I want to step back and go back to the dissociative disorders. Of the four, we have the associative identity disorder, known as DID. Um, some people now call it, it used to be called the multiple personality disorder. So, dissociative identity disorder is the multiple personality disorder. I don't know if you guys believe in that. Some people are very, very devoted to that diagnosis. Other people don't. I'm very apprehensive, but honestly, I'm not a psychologist, but I find it hard to believe that there is such thing. And we did in the other class talk about Richard Rivera, who um, was it Richard Rivera? Hmm, tough day. But he pretended that he was psychologically have different personalities until he overheard a doctor say, well, if he really did have multiple personalities, there has to be at least three. And suddenly he developed the third. So I think that a lot of people fake it. However, when I was young, there was this big book and a big case everybody talked about, all about Eve, who had multiple personalities. I don't know, but we don't say multiple personality disorders anymore. We say dissociative disorders. This one is a dissociative identity disorder, so dead. Okay, dissociative amnesia. This is where a person can has a traumatic event and suddenly can't remember common and easy information, and it even can involve personal information. Usually, when you hear somebody has amnesia, if in fact they have some amnesia, it's usually dissociative amnesia, where something was so traumatic that the brain is trying to protect the person. Dissociative fugue is kind of the same way in that it is a very rare condition, and the person is suddenly, without planning or warning, travels from home and work and leaves behind everything, and then suddenly one day they may realize there's someplace else. Or this could be a person who was picked up by um, an ambulance or police officer, and he has no idea of who he is or where he is or what's going on and how he got there. And the fourth one that I want you to know is depersonalization disorder. It's marked by periods of feelings disconnected or detached from one's body and thoughts of depersonalization. And so that sometimes it's feeling as if you're obsessing yourself outside your body. You know how they say, and this is not an example of it, but you know how they say some people, when they're dying, leave their body and above they can see themselves. This is just like that, except the person isn't dying, but it is hit with some kind of trauma or some kind of depersonalization incident that they're not functioning as whoever they really are. There is a guy named Dr. David Abramson. He was famous for a book called The Murdering Mind. And he believes that the source of many serial killers is frustration. You ever get so frustrated that you'll say that you want to kill somebody, but certainly you aren't gonna? He's proposing that those that become serial killers is the same, except they really do go kill him. He's famous for a quote: frustration is the wet nurse of violence. So if somehow we can reduce frustration in lives, then we can reduce mental illness and we can reduce violence. Frustration is not an emotion, but a state of being that often leads to anger, sadness, and depression. Frustration is, and violence, in my opinion, is when you get so frustrated that you don't think there's any other alternative. I think that's especially true in domestic violence. What do you think? Do you think that that's true, or that frustration plays a role? Um, and I think that frustration plays a role in goal attainment, and that you're trying to get this hair's killing me. You're trying to get what you're trying to achieve, and without achieving it, you just keep getting um, going from the tangible to the intangible. So, for example, if you're the type of person who just has to be filthy rich, okay, and or you're so much in love with somebody who's way out of your league, you just become increasingly frustrated and you don't know how to deal with it. Okay, so before we got some of these modern theories, we had something called phrenology, and it's the study of your skull, and it's kind of fun. And some people still today believe that this is true. I personally don't buy into it, but what do I know compared to these doctors? But some of you have maybe heard of Cesar Lombroso. You probably heard about him briefly in your Intro to Criminal Justice class. And he believes that habitual criminals have very weak natures, are atavistic, and can be identified by physical attributes. So he initially studied primates, monkeys, and then he started studying the human skull. Because of this and other theories, Lombroso is considered the father of criminology. But he would make these elaborate charts of your skull, and he would use identify those characteristics in terms of distant ancestors. What used to be funny was when you got arrested, they would measure your head and they would measure different parts of different regions, like this region, everything else. And they were surprisingly accurate on which part of the brain associates with what type of response or behavior. And he then would identify it and file it, much like we do with fingerprints. And that's how they would identify somebody if they later were found dead or they escaped and they had to identify him later. They would compare his head in phrenology, which is kind of cool but kind of crazy at the same time, in my opinion. Okay, so some people still say that it's not a valid science. When you look at the slideshow, you will see on slide 11 an example of how Lombroso regionalized phrenology into your brain to tell you what parts is which. So, for example, number 5 is continuity, and that's right here in your brain. Got a feeling a lot of us are lacking that, right? But it's kind of fun. Make sure you take a look at it. And then there's another chart right afterwards that shows it with in terms of the neck and where your blood flow is to your brain. And Lombroso felt that criminals were born that way. It is not something that they experienced or developed, but that they were predisposed to being cold, cruel, show absolutely no remorse, and rationalized everything that they did, and they had to do it because of somebody else, obviously. They didn't have any close friends, and they were very quick to sell out their partners if it was to their benefit. Sounds like today's criminals in some cases, all right? So he would, in a different way of looking at things, according to Lombroso's criminal categories, the habitual criminal engages in crime because he or she has no choice. Do you agree with that? Does a criminal have no choice because he's biologically targeted to be that way, wired that way? What do you think? Okay, jukes, calicacs, and mutineers. These are old terms for different types of criminals. And it was argued that criminality was inherited. Um, Sometime for fun, Google Captain Bligh and Mutiny on the Bounty. What's interesting about it is a research study was done that showed that people who participated in the mutiny all had children and all of them became criminals. Is that coincidental? Or is that just science that we can't stop? Um, oh, and just in case you were wondering, a juke is someone who tries to deceive. He's a fake. And a calicac, which I just think is a fun word, is a fictitious name of an actual family that the focus of sociological study. One branch of feeble minded descendants are mostly social degenerates, while another branch of descendants of normal intelligence and primarily successful. So it's an interesting study. But they're just fun words too, and they're all real. So to understand serial killers, we have to take a look at them from many different avenues. So that's why for the last couple of weeks, we have been examining why they become killers and try and figure out what is the primary focus. So is it genetics? Or is it something that's only triggered by traumatic situations? Or I don't know. Is there a biosocial component, and meaning that it's the two parts working together? There's a guy named Hans. Forgive me, I might mispronounce Hans' last name. It's Eysenck, and he was hitting the prime of his career in 1977. And he said, from a biological perspective, it can be argued that homicide and other criminality stems from both environmental and personality traits, inherited personality traits. So your genetics may give you the predisposition, but you still have to have some kind of trigger. Um, He attributed criminality to persons born with nervous systems characteristics distinct from normal. I got a problem with that because I don't know what normal is. But these people usually have things that cause them to conflict with social norms and different types of societal expectations like rules and things like that. All right, so Hans also talks about extroverts and introverts. For those of you who don't know, an extrovert is somebody who's very outgoing, very comfortable being a very public person kind of thing. An introvert is somebody who's usually more reserved, quiet, into themselves. It's very interesting to note that in society studies of actors and actresses, many of them perform and earn their money by being extroverts, but in reality, they're introverts. They go home, they close the door, they want the quiet, they want to hide from all the others. But Hans argues that extroverts are more likely to display antisocial behavior and maybe even advance into criminality. And the personality disorders, the substantial symptom overlap of the personality disorders in two patterns are cognition and affectivity. All right, cognition is your perception and your understanding, interpretations of yourself, of other people, of the community as a whole, and different events. So you and I may experience the same event, but because of our cognition and how we interpret that, it could be a very different experience for two different people, though it was the same incident. The second word terminology you need to know is affectivity, which is the range, intensity, and appropriateness of the person's emotional response. So, do they have impulse control? Do they have interpersonal functioning? So, when you have a really traumatic event, do you share that with anybody? Do you say, I need to talk about this and hash it out? Even if you don't say it that way, but you tell somebody, you get it out, you share it, and it helps you to filter it and to come to a better understanding of what happened. And these two personality disorders, if you don't have those two, the cognition and affectivity, you get lost in criminality. Okay, this is a lot of material. I'm going to actually primarily go through what is written on your blackboard, but you need to have a quick understanding of these different terminologies, okay? And you know it'll be on a test because I'm taking the time to go through these things. The first one is paranoia. Okay, paranoia is usually unfounded very exaggerated distrust of others. There's always that joke that most of us have heard many times. Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean I'm wrong. And often, those kind of things where you could be burned in a sociological situation um, creates it and proves to them that this is true. That maybe um, everybody hates me. Maybe the FBI is spying on me. Maybe they're using the antennas in my house to monitor myself and my neighbors. Um, there's all sorts of versions, but paranoia can be a very stressful, very painful problem. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, and what it is, it's a group of orders, and it's marked by severely impaired thinking, emotions, and behaviors. And they're usually unable to filter out and understand the sounds, the colors, and other features of their new environment. And if untreated, they can withdraw from interactions with other people and lose their ability to take care of personal needs and grooming. The prevalence of schizophrenia is thought to be about 1% of the population. I got to tell you a quick story. When I first got hurt and I was in the wheelchair, until very recently, all those years, I had this guy who's a schizophrenic who would help me around the house. He would help me in the garden and he'd help me with shoveling snow and stuff. The guy, I would say to him, please come at 10 o'clock. He'd come in a quarter of. No matter what time I picked, he'd there is quarter because he found solace in routine and schedule. His hygiene was reprehensible. I mean, it was disgusting. And I would have to gently say to him, at least come in and wash your hands and wash your face. His teeth were all rotten. Most of them were missing. And in fairness to him, some of that is the disease does not encourage you to um, clean yourself up. But on top of that, the medication that is given to schizophrenics often causes really bad teeth. The two together in a schizophrenic don't look for much. They don't brush their teeth. They probably don't have many teeth. And they don't use things like mouthwash or something. Okay. And he would get very confused. Sometimes he would hallucinate. Um, and yet he was always right. So sometimes it's very difficult to talk to somebody like that. A schizoid is a personality marked by extreme shyness. So this is the opposite almost of schizophrenia. A schizoid is very seclusive and is unable to form any close relationships. They live in loneliness and they feel comfort in loneliness. A lot of terms this in this PowerPoint. The next one is antisocial personality disorder, which is repetitive behavior patterns contrary to usual morality and ethics standards of the public and cause people to experience continuous conflict with society. They're aggressive, they're callous, they don't care what you think at all. They're very impulsive, and planning is not something they like to do. They're irresponsible and they're hostile, and they have a very low frustration rate and very immature. Okay, they certainly also can't benefit from an experience. If you had an experience, like for example, you're walking some way and you fall, they wouldn't say, "Oh, next time I got to walk the other way so I don't fall down because this is in rough shape." No, not them. Okay. The next one is borderline personality. This is a personality that is very long term and it's a pattern. And it's a pattern of interpersonal relationships behavior, good and self image, that interfere with social and occupational functioning, or cause extreme emotional distress, instability, impulsiveness, intense or poorly controlled anger, inability to tolerate being alone, and chronic feelings of emptiness. Affected individuals sometimes seem to be on the borderline of psychosis and highly unstable in their mood, behavior, self image. And these people are like living in a windstorm constantly. Um, hey, if you're a fan of Sopranos, remember the episode where Tony found out that his mother arranged a hit on him and he confronts her? Total denial, doesn't care. He just doesn't care, and it was something that she did impulsively, but feels she has to back up. And definitely his mother drives you nuts, and it works for her. All right, histrionics. Oh my God, every time I think of histrionics, it seems like some teenage girls have to go through that phase. This is where the person is totally excessively dramatic about whatever is going on. Something could have happened, and yes, it was problematic, but it's not the end of the world. But in that person's mind, they're a victim. It's awful. It's got to be dealt with. A narcissist. We all kind of know that term, but a narcissist is somebody who has excessive admiration and love for themselves and wants to make sure that they have the primary condition. And they get total erotic pleasure from contemplation or admiration of their own body or self as a fixation. These are people, it's me, and me, and not you. Okay, avoidant personality disorder is marked by extreme shyness and sensitivity to rejection. Because of the sensitivity, the person becomes socially withdrawn, and their self esteem is usually very low, and embarrassment and fear keep them in their little shell. And a personality disorder characterized by long term passivity. Okay, and there's more on that page, but we've hit the key ones. And I think that you need to know that on this page, there is, let me see, 5, 10, and you need to be able to identify the ones that we haven't discussed as things like obsessive compulsive disorder and things like that. But just realize you need to know this, and there's definitions available for all of you. All right. The next one is control and power, love and hate, frustration and aggression, fantasy, abandonment, and intimacy are all primary factors in psychopathy of serial killers. They need to control you. They need to think that you love them and that you will do anything for them and that you will be compliant. There are some who like non-compliance as a sexual trigger, but generally speaking, they want to be your everything. Okay. There is probably, if somebody's talking to you and says, "Oh, you know about serial killers?" and you want to fake it real good, know these next 2 slides. There is about a guy named Hare developed a policy, and I mean a theory, and it's got 2 factors. Factor 1 are the tools of psychopathy. Their glibness, superficial, grandiose, pathological lying, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callousness, lack of empathy, and failure to accept responsibility for their actions. These are all tools of the serial killer, where the no, excuse me, please. Factor 2 are the deficits of the serial killer's psychopath. Okay, they need a stimulation and prone to boredom, the parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility. Usually we're juvenile delinquents and have had revocations of conditional release. In other words, they can't even see through a punishment. These are the two factors that we are going to be looking at throughout the rest of the semester as we talk about different types of killers. When we talk about types from now on in, after today, we are going to be talking about different categories: male killers, women killers, health workers, things like that. The stories that we're going to be talking aren't designed to frighten you, but to educate you. All right. There's a chart here that I put together for sociopaths and psychopaths. We in this class will probably just use the words interchangeably in that we wouldn't define them significantly different. However, there are differences. A sociopath has a long history of criminal behavior. A sociopath also has average to below average intelligence. A psychopath has average to above intelligence. And the psychopath, while the sociopath has the long criminal history, sociopath has little or no criminal history. They're both antisocial. They don't get along with society, they don't get along with people. The sociopath is got very explosive temperament. The psychopath is got great social skills. They can blend in. The first time I became very close to a psychopath, was in prison, and eventually he and I got into an incident, and I earned the New York State Medal of Honor because of him. But he's charming. Though he was not well educated, he was very intelligent and a pleasure to be talking to. It's just that he could turn any minute and kill you. Technicalities in a relationship. All right, a sociopath is very limited in their social skills, where a psychopath has very little emotional response. If they do have a social response, it is to duplicate what they've seen to impress you to believe that they're the same as you. So if a room full of people are laughing, they'll laugh because they don't want to appear different and stand out to you. A good example of an advanced psychopath that most of us know is the BTK, bind, torture, and kill. His real name is Dennis Rader, and he is definitely a psychopath. He is extremely intelligent. He could blend into society anywhere. He looked normal and regular. He dressed normal and regular, held jobs. None of them were super challenging jobs or super money jobs, but they're jobs that got you to mingle and travel around a bit. He was somebody like a whole slew of people with this personality. They can be the polygraph because they have no galvanic skin response. The skin doesn't start getting all sweaty and nervous or anything else. They are also in the act, they're very calm at the kill. I gotta tell you, I would be horrified if I was a victim or seeing a kill or something, but it would be twice as terrifying if the person was just calm while they were victimizing people. I just find that strikingly terrible. These people are compulsive liars, so they have no problem lying that, no, I didn't do that, where in fact they had. Take a second and acknowledge that we're going to be studying this semester women serial killers. While there's not a lot of them, there's significantly more than what most people think. The most famous woman killer is Eileen Wuornos. And women, just like Eileen, appear to exhibit traits just like the man with the psychopathy. This is a woman who had a very difficult early life and eventually developed all the possible forms of mentality Some from, I would say some you could argue in her case was genetic, but certainly experiential. Another one is Dorothea Helen Puente. And she's a little old lady. And you see her, I would expect you to open the door for her, help carry things for her, because she's a rather feeble old lady. Um, and like most women serial killers, she's very insincere. She has no morality and she's impulsive. She uses manipulation and charm and charisma to do most of her work because she has no conscience and she plays into that so that she can accomplish what she wants to get done. And they have very little insight into what they're doing is horrific and they don't learn from their mistakes. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick example, which I haven't decided because I haven't written your test yet, but maybe it'll come up because it's kind of interesting. It's a case example. Years ago, a patient named Calvin executed his college roommate. So you're sharing a dorm with somebody and he kills you. He shot him with a shotgun to his head as he slept. The roommate had told Calvin not to use his laundry detergent and that he would have to purchase his own. Prior to the killing that evening, Calvin had been reading Dr. Abramson's book, The Murder Mind. That's the frustration theory that we talked about. And said that he had been fantasizing about killing someone for a long time. What prompted Calvin to kill? Why would you kill your roommate in college? So think about it. Why did it happen? Okay, this is a lot of fun in class to have a discussion on, but I want you to think about this also. This is called the trolley problem. A runaway trolley is traveling at a very high speed towards a train station. By pushing a large man off of a bridge into the trolley's path, the man will die, but the five others at the train station will be spared. What do? Do you push the man off the bridge? Do you flip a switch that will divert the train and spare the five, but will kill a man on the diverted track? Or you do nothing in hopes that people will get out of the way? Think about that. It, I'm not asking you to tell me what you would do, but what you do tells us a lot about you. The rest is websites and movies to check out. I'll see you guys soon.